welcome to episode 121 of The Route presented by White Whale Marketing. The Route is a glorified sports business coffee chat that has a new guest every episode as they share their experiences and in sports. I'm Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. As always, we just have a few things to cover before we begin. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see here at the top hand corner it says at The Route Sports. So check us out on all social media platforms. That's LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the good stuff. You can find us there. When podcasts come out, we have a post with a little episode cover where you can kind of find out more about them and ways to tune in. So check us out there. And in addition to that, in between episodes, we post clips about the podcast. So feel free to check that out, and maybe you'll have a little snippet that you're like, hey, maybe I should tune into that episode. So check us out at The Route Sports, and that's on all platforms, including LinkedIn. Additionally, if you're listening, if you're watching, take the time to subscribe, follow, rate 5 stars, leave a like. It's all good stuff as it allows the podcast to grow a little bit easier. So when you get a chance, do that, and it's much appreciated. Now with those admin stuff covered, we can now get into today's guest. So I'd now like to welcome someone who has a wealth of experience in both optimization and strategy of sponsorships, with his previous 2 roles being with the Toronto Wolfpack and T1 Agency. Current Director of Nielsen Sports, Scott Lidbury. Welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Chris, I'm well. How are you?
Not too bad. Thank you for joining me. And the way I like to start every single episode is just taking you through the route. So where did it start and how did we get to where we are today?
Where did it start? Well, it started in Australia, where I'm from. I grew up in a city called Canberra, Australia. It's actually the capital. I went to the University of Canberra. I actually studied journalism, which I'm not a journalist, so clearly that is not where it ended. But I studied journalism. I went into university thinking about all these courses I need to do to further my career, politics, etc. And then I shortly realized after a couple of years, actually in my degree, that why don't I study things that I'm into, that I enjoy? And that led me to start doing work in sports. So I studied as my major at university, sports administration, did some work with some sports organizations in Australia. And then eventually, when I finished my degree in journalism with some sports experience as well, I did realize that I wasn't really going to become a journalist, but I stayed in the media field. So I actually worked for a media intelligence company in Australia that was called Media Monitors. We used to track predominantly print and radio coverage and deliver briefs to clients. That was a job I did after university full time for about a year. And then during that time, I discovered that within this company, Media Monitors, that I worked for, actually in Sydney, Australia at that time, the biggest city, that they had a sports marketing research division, which was called SIS, Sponsorship Information Services. And they used to analyze media exposure for their sponsorship clients, Red Bull being an example, the exposure they were getting across print coverage from a range of their athletes. And that is really what started me on my path to my career in sports marketing.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I guess before we kind of dive into your route a bit further, what was that realization? I know you're kind of touching it to an extent about, hey, maybe I should study something I'm more interested in. But was there a specific, I don't know, maybe class, maybe conversation? Like what pushed you over the edge to be like, hey, I got to change something here?
I think it was probably failure, to be honest. Failure teaches us all a lot. And in my first year or 2 university, I was not very successful, to be open. I didn't do very well in some of my courses. And it got me thinking, what am I going to actually study that I'll be passionate about or good at? And it led me to one of my biggest recreational interests, which was sports, not so much as an athlete, but more of a fan. So I would say it was as a point in my early 20s where I determined that why do all this additional work to learn something about maybe an area I didn't have as much grounding in? Why don't I try and study and develop acumen in an area that I'm actually engaging with in my spare time anyway, which was sports. So that was really what led me to it. Failing at what I was trying to do, what I thought I needed to do, which led me to ultimately what I like to do. And that was a key lesson for me early in my career.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to be honest, as you say that, I kind of revert back to myself. I initially went to school for accounting, and like you were saying there about your experiences, I wasn't doing well. I didn't want to go to class. I actually had a job at a stadium here in Ottawa, and I always wanted to go to work and pick up shifts rather than going to my accounting courses. And then after a while, I was like, you know what? Maybe I should just do this for a living. So I completely understand that sentiment. And I guess once you made that shift, what were the types of things you were doing? Because I know I felt like I was behind and I had to start networking. I had to start, branding myself as a sports marketer. What types of things were you able to do kind of to make that shift?
Yeah, so I'd say when I first started working in research in the sports marketing area in this company, I just dove into the work. So I was, you know, evaluating media exposure for Red Bull, as I mentioned, other sports, and it was probably my next job that really launched me into my fully fledged sports career in Australia. So through my role that I was discussing earlier, I actually got to do some TV audience analytics. So I then started to combine some core sets of like media, TV audience analytics, research with sports, wrapping it all together. And that allowed me to get a job at Fox Sports, which is the biggest subscription television station in Australia, obviously has a presence throughout the globe. And that was really the job where I was like, wow, like I am truly working in sports now. I was a business analyst. I would do media evaluation or their media rights deals. So, for example, bidding for, television rights for the NBA, Premier League, Australian sports, and I would run the analytics on those in terms of audience projections, production costs, etc. And at that point, I was obviously working in a TV network. And for those who've had that experience, it's quite a thrilling experience. You're mixing with the on-air talent. You're obviously sitting behind the scenes more in that analytics role. But for me, that was the role in my mid-20s that really set me up to have a recognized sports brand on my resume, still working in analytics and media, but ultimately did then set me up for what was to come in my career.
Yeah, and then I guess before we dive into that a little further, how did you get that first job in sports? 'Cause I think that's a major question that people have that listen to this podcast is, how did you, was it someone you knew? Was it just simply through an application? How did you get that first job, which then led to your Fox Sports position?
For me, it was really an internal move in an organization. So as I mentioned, there was a sponsorship marketing research division in a wider media intelligence company that I worked for. I can't recall exactly how I heard about the position, but I believe it was advertised internally. So I essentially saw something that I thought I had a good fit for, even though I was early in my career. I applied and I was able to make what was a sideways move at the time to then get more within that sports area. So I would say it was keeping my eyes open within an organization, maybe in a role that I wasn't 100% passionate about, but I did see something else that allowed me to pivot my career quite early, and that was ultimately what set me off on my path.
And then from there, how did the Fox Sports job come about? Because obviously you were then working in sports. You kind of pivoted, as you were saying, to that different type of career path. But then how did you then kind of advance and then maybe you can continue on from there as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just applied for a job that I saw. It was as simple as that, and it all went from there quite quickly. It's interesting. That is not how the second half of my career has typically been, which I'm sure we'll touch on. The first half was really more that transactional style of I saw a job, I applied for it, I got the job, and I was on my way. But in Canada, that hasn't really been my experience as much for whatever reason. But at that time, that's how it worked. I was probably looking for jobs in sports or media or analytics. I found something, it looked like a good fit, and I applied for it and I got the job. So it was really as simple as that.
And then as you were saying there, you kind of touched on Canada, right? obviously going from Australia to Canada, that's quite the jump. We've had people on the podcast kind of go from Brazil to Alabama to Canada. There's obviously some types of cultural differences and even just a big jump as a whole for someone's lifestyle. How did that come about? What made you want to go to Canada, and then what opportunity came from that?
Yeah, sure. So it was actually, I was visiting a good friend of mine in Toronto in 2012, I think it was. I had never been to Canada. I'd never been to Toronto. I came up and I visited the city, and my overriding feeling was it seemed like a very livable city. It was obviously in a North American sports market, major league teams, which I thought was pretty cool. So at the time, I was eligible to get a working holiday visa. I went back to Australia. I applied for it. I had a year to decide if I wanted to use it. By that time, I actually had my last position in Australia before I came here, which was with an organization called Repicom back in that sports marketing measurement space. And the longer that year went, when I was working for Repicom, I had a good job in sports there still. I just kept thinking, if I don't make this move now, I will regret it. And I made the move. I quit my job in Australia and I moved over. And I came over in 2014, so a bit over 8 years ago. And that's for me when the power of networking really started to come to fruition in my career, because I came to a market where I effectively knew one person who wasn't really in the industry that I was looking to move into. So the previous style of how I'd worked in Australia in my 20s, of just applying for jobs and moving around a little bit organically in that way, that was not the approach that I used when I came to Canada. It was all about, who do I know who can connect me with people in the industry here? Who can I speak to, and how can I ultimately open up some opportunities? And that's really a journey that started for me upon arrival in Toronto in 2014.
Yeah, is that something you could expand on? Because I noticed even just recently when we're putting out clips, whenever it references networking and how to go about it, it's something that seems to always do well. Because I remember when I was in university, I went to my first networking event, and I was about to walk in, and I was like, "Hey, I have no idea what I'm about to do." And I called my dad quickly. I'm like, "Hey, what do I do?" And he's like, "Just go talk to the first person you see." Right. So obviously that's a little different because you're entering a new country. But what were the types of things you were doing to, build that value up and maybe get to know more people?
Yeah, it's a great question, because honestly, it's not something I did coming out of school myself. So when I see students and young professionals like going to events and networking and reaching out to people on LinkedIn, I'm so impressed, because that was not something I was doing in my early 20s, for example. I really only started doing it probably when I was around 30, when I came to Canada. So for me, it was fairly simple. It was identifying people that I already knew from Australia that probably had some connection to the North American sports industry, particularly Canada. Maybe they'd worked over here, maybe they knew someone. I would talk to them, they would connect me into someone locally. It was that typical thing of, in that time, it wasn't really a big time for, Zoom calls or anything like that. It was more, meeting people for a beer or for a coffee. So that's really just what I tried to do. I would speak to people about the industry, not talk too much about myself, but let them know what I'd done and what I was looking for, and hope that they could connect me onto another person that perhaps can lead me closer to an opportunity. And that's essentially what happened. I had actually been speaking to a gentleman who'd worked for the company that I worked for in Australia, but in Canada. And he was able to connect me to a recruiter, who then connected me to another person who ultimately offered me my first job in Canada.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how that works, where it's almost like a domino effect, right? Once the first one falls, then the others start going from there. Did you find, like, through that experience, was it like, for example, I remember when I was graduating university, I applied to an endless amount of jobs, and it was a little bit here, a little bit there, and I felt like it was almost a numbers game. Did you find that's what it was, or was it more so it was once you've met that right person or that right recruiter? Like, how did that kind of feel? Was it something that you felt like, hey, this is a longer process than expected, or fairly quick?
I think from a networking perspective, yes, you want to find those quality relationships that can connect you to the right people, but it is a little bit of a numbers game too. The more conversations you have, the more doors you might open. So that was certainly my experience. But yeah, I mean, I was quite lucky. I always think that I was pretty lucky when I came to Canada. I came, I think, in September 2014, middle of the month. I went to my friend's wedding. I went down to New York. I wasn't really seriously looking for a job until probably the start of October. But by mid-November, I was employed. So really, it was like a 6-week journey for me. And I feel like there was an element of luck in that, to be honest, because times post that where I've changed positions in Canada, even leaving a job before having another job to go to, it has taken me often that 3-4 month period to, via networking, find that opportunity. So I consider myself quite lucky when I came to Canada. I was able to connect. I would say 6 weeks is relatively quickly, but I would encourage people, if they're embarking on this journey of networking, it's you've got to give yourself at least 3-4 months to make those connections, or longer, because it takes time. I think in that day we're in now, the ability to have Zoom calls can make you a lot more efficient. So perhaps you can expedite that. But my initial experience in Canada, while it was challenging, I consider myself quite lucky that I was able to find a position essentially within 6 to 7 weeks of looking for one in a new country.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive in itself. And I guess now we're at the point where you're in Canada. You found this new position. Do you mind maybe sharing what that was and then how things kind of evolved from there?
Yeah, sure. So the company I first worked for in Canada was called IMI International. They're a market leader in research in the space, not just in sports, but in other areas too. So I was lucky enough to get connected to a gentleman by the name of Don Mayo, who I owe a lot for my career here in Canada. He offered me a short-term contract to see what I had in Canada. I think I did okay because I was able to turn that into a full-time position at the start of 2015. But he, having known that I'd worked on, sports in Australia and worked for Fox Sports, he threw me right into accounts with the NHL, NHL teams. I was able to work with clients such as NBA Canada, also some brands around their sponsorship investments. So I was able to develop my network quite quickly because IMI had a culture of getting out to events and looking after their clients, entertaining their clients. So I was going to like NHL Winter Classics, All Stars within 3-4 months of my job there, which I was very privileged to do. So that, I think, straight away got me into a place where I could meet people, I could network, not at that time because I thought I'd be going to another job, but just to expand my network quite quickly. So I was working in analytics as a sponsorship consultant at IMI. I was providing data and analytics and insights to not only properties, so teams, the NHL, other leagues, etc., entertainment properties, cultural properties, Toronto Film Festival, Juno Awards, etc., and then also doing some work with agencies and brands around evaluating the sponsorship investment. So it's still quite closely related to what I do today. They're probably more of a competitor now in my landscape in the company I work for now. But I had 3.5 great years working with IMI. I have a lot of great friends there still, and it just was such a great job for me to establish a network in Canada, and that was so important for me here to have that, because I've certainly been able to leverage that as I've gone through the last 8 and a bit years living in this market.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And funny enough, when you're kind of going through that, I was like, hey, that kind of sounds like, Nielsen now. So is that something where that experience that you had at this first job in Canada, you're like, hey, that's something I wanted to get back to, or how did that develop, or let's say transpire afterwards, right? So let's say those first 3.5 years in Canada take place. Is it something that you wanted to try, something new? Did you want to like how did that come about, and then how did you end up at Nielsen?
Yeah, so there's a couple of other positions before I got to Nielsen, so I'll maybe just run you through those so you have some context. So I undertook in 2017, which I would call the biggest passion project of my career. a new rugby team had come to Canada at the start of this 2017, the Toronto Wolfpack. I know you've had one of my former colleagues on your podcast before. And for me, this was like a really cool moment because the form of rugby league that the Wolfpack played was the sport that I really first grew up with in Sydney, Australia. It was like what my dad watched, what his dad watched, probably like hockey for a lot of people in Canada. So when I heard about this team, I was like, wow, that's cool. How's this going to work? It was in a transatlantic league or playing games in England and flying back and forth. I was just a fan, year one, down in Liberty Village. If you went to a game, it was a good fun time. It was a real party atmosphere and an entertaining product on the field. And I actually, a little bit like you, but slightly different focus, started doing a podcast about the team. My friend and I, we started doing a podcast about the Wolfpack and our experience because it was my Australian friend that I grew up with who lives here now too, growing up with the sport, what it was like in this new city that we call home. And through that, we got a little bit of buzz just from people in that community. And it ultimately got to the point where we'd sort of worked our way closer and closer to the administration and the center of the team, to the point of where I was able to get quite cozy with the owner and talk about, well, this is what I do beyond doing a podcast, and I work in marketing and sponsorship analytics and optimizing ROI, etc. To the point of where I actually got offered the opportunity to effectively head up the commercial operations for that team at the end of 2017. So it was a bit of a strange move for me at the time because I went from a very analytics driven role, sort of sitting in between brands, properties, and agencies, to then go directly into sports, as a commercial lead role, but also a lot of administrative duties as well. So that was a bit of a pivot for me at the time. I didn't quite know where it would go, but I worked in that role for 2018, and it was an interesting year, but a very fun one, and taught me a lot of lessons ahead of what was to come later in my career.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And as you mentioned, I had John on, I think, probably 105 episodes ago, but I was able to connect with him not too long ago, and he's just talking about the experiences then. I even remember when I had him on the podcast, and he was just talking about the Wolfpack. I was like, wow, like what an experience that is, right? Where it felt like a completely different game day experience from other sports that were here. So I understand that passion that you kind of had behind it, and even just funny enough that you started a podcast, and then kind of that's what allowed you to kind of get into the inner workings of it. And was that something that I know you were saying like you weren't necessarily expecting it? But was that a welcome change, or is that something where afterwards you're like, hey, I kind of want to go back to my old roots, let's say?
Yeah, I'd say at the time when I did leave, it was a welcome change, not because I didn't like my previous position, but it was, as a sports fan, I'd never quite found the right avenue to work directly within a sports organization. I'd more been around the periphery of the industry and in support roles like analytics is. And I mean, I was working for a broadcaster in Australia. So, when I was at the Wolfpack, I went in probably not with my eyes fully open into what it is like working for a small, lean startup organization trying to establish its place in a very competitive sports market. So I'd say by the end of a year or so doing that, I was probably ready to explore maybe what was next, because as much fun as that that team was, like, it unfortunately wasn't created on a very sustainable financial model with the travel involved and everything else. So at the end of my first season, I'd had about a year and a half there. I decided I needed a break, just left my position on my own volition and took some time out. I actually went back to Australia for a visit, and I needed a bit of a refresh. And when I came back, it was back into networking. What do I want to do? Who do I want to talk to? And at that time, everything was on the table for me. I knew I wanted to stay in sports, but it could have been brand, property, agency, or something else. And at that time, I had the opportunity to move into the agency space with T1, which again probably pushed me back, or not, led me back into what my career was prior to the Wolfpack opportunity, which was more in that consulting analytics space. And for me at the time, I don't think I went into it like intentionally, like I want to go back there. But once I was back there, it did feel a space that was familiar. I had a lot of experience in, and even though I'd worked directly for a smaller property, I still had a lot of experience that I could call on in that role, in addition to my previous experience to leverage in the role with the T1 agency.
Yeah, it's just funny when you're kind of referring to, let's say, experience at a Wolfpack or let's say a professional team, then going to an agency or consulting, completely different, right? Where a lot of the times it almost seems teams are like these small businesses or small startups, or even though they're nationally or even internationally, it's still a lot of, let's say, putting out fires or different things where you're not, let's say, building out for the future. It's more so, hey, let's look at the next game or the next week or different things like that. So I can only imagine the change that kind of brought upon you with that shift. And then what was it like working at at the T1 agency? Obviously, you said it wasn't something you were expecting, but once you were back, it kind of felt nice. What was that experience like? And then how did that lead to your next role afterwards?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say you could almost divide my time at T1 into two parts, because I joined in 2019 and then I left in 2021. So clearly the world looked a lot different in 2021 to what it did in 2019. So my first year there, I mean, T1 and Mark Harrison, who's great, always, have a lot of events, sponsorship X. They would, have events at the NFL draft in the US and events all around Canada to bring together people from the industry. So the first year for me was, while my job was very consulting analytics focused, getting out to events, something that I really enjoyed, meeting people, something I'd got to do a lot in my time at IMI when I first moved to Canada. But in terms of a work perspective, it did broaden my skill set, because I was not just doing sports sponsorship work now. I was actually looking at, charitable sponsorship strategy and other, smaller national sporting organizations. So I would say it was some more purpose driven work, which I hadn't really done a lot of in my professional career prior to that. So that was something that was maybe not my sweet spot, but again, an opportunity to expand my skills. And then obviously, COVID really hit the world hard in 2020. I was about a year into my position then with the agency, and yeah, like that was a tough time for a lot of people. I was very lucky to keep my position right throughout COVID at the agency, which I'm very grateful for. But the client work changed in its nature. It was obviously less event driven. It was more trying to help clients pivot their strategies, reevaluate their sponsorships, redistribute assets, etc. So that was a massive learning in itself as well. I think it was at the same time quite a high stress environment for me at that time, starting to work at home, maybe not fully understanding yet how to manage those boundaries between a home and work life. So I learned some very valuable lessons, I think, in my second year, which I would have learned likely at any organization I was working for. But overall, I had a great 2 years at T1, learned a lot from people like Mark Harrison and others. And yeah, still have a lot of good relationships there, and always leave your positions on good terms if you can, would be something I'd say to people, because it's certainly, when we think about networking, it's good to be able to go back to those relationships and people to know that what you're about, whether you are at an organization or you've moved on for another reason.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense, and obviously that's a huge shift in itself, right? Where no one saw what was going to come with the pandemic, but then especially with the space you're in, that's a whole change in itself. And then you were kind of touching on there, let's say boundaries that you were having to set. Obviously, that's something a lot of people have to deal with now, especially with working from home. And I know myself, my bedroom's just across the wall here, and I get up, I have a meeting first thing in the morning, and I take a couple steps, and I'm at my desk, and it feels like I don't leave. So were you kind of touching on maybe some of those skill sets that you learned to maybe set those boundaries, and if so, what are those? Because I'd even love to hear those.
No, sure. I mean, it's a great question, and a lot of us just learned during the pandemic, right? So my experience was probably checking emails at whatever time that I wanted on my phone when I wake up, next to my bed. I would stay at my computer at night till I got my work done, maybe jump on a bit, check my emails before I went to bed. Like, it was a total blending of the work and home life. Before COVID, I was never really a work from home person. I always liked going into an office, being in a working environment. But I did get burnt out during that period. It caught up with me in ways that had never happened in my career, both mentally. So what are some of those skills that I've developed since then? I'd say number one is just that separation between home and work life. I still work from home 99% of the time today. So just little things like not checking your emails till you actually sit at your computer and log on for the day. Sometimes you have to make exceptions to that rule, but for me, you've got to let work, you've got to control your working hours a bit. Just like when you leave your computer at night, if you can, don't check your emails on your phone later in the evening. For all of us, that may not be possible, but for me, I've been able to manage that fairly well. A second thing for me is just making sure you're doing everything you can to be as mentally and physically fit as you can. So times that some of us may have used to spend driving to work, um, catching transit to work. To me, I use that time for exercise each morning to make sure I'm starting the day off right. So I'd say they're the two biggest things, and just being aware as well of your your stress levels and your mental state, because there's nothing wrong with putting your hand up when maybe you're not feeling 100%. And I think there's been a lot of progress with that over the last couple of years in working environments, the more acceptance of, it's not just about working hard and driving yourself into the ground. It's about, to be an effective employee and a colleague and a worker, you need to know, your times of high strength, high stress, and how to manage that. Because if you just burn out in 6 to 12 months, like, you're not going to be much good to yourself or anyone else. So, few ideas there. There's lots of thoughts about it online, I know, but for me, it's really that, creating your own boundaries and being as mentally and physically healthy as you possibly can.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic stuff. Because even for myself, in regards to, let's say, emails, right? That's the beast that ends all. And whether first thing, sometimes in the morning, I wake up and there's some client emails, I'm trying to answer them right away, or I'm making eggs and right, you're answering that. But then that's what you're saying. You don't have that boundary where sometimes at the end of the week, it feels like I have to leave my apartment, because then it feels like this is my work, right? This feels like the office. So sometimes I feel like I have to leave to kind of set that boundary. But obviously, that's something that you learn with time. Um, but no, thank you for sharing that, because I think, right, with everyone working from home now, or even, I'm not sure if schooling is online, but I'm sure even if they are, that's something that's probably very beneficial. And then one of the things I kind of wanted to ask, you were saying earlier, right, how the first part of your career was a lot of more transaction related, where you'd apply, get the job, kind of go on from there. Then you're speaking about how your second half was a little bit different. So do you mind maybe expanding on that, right? So obviously you worked at T1, and then now you're at Nielsen, but then what were the ways it was different? Obviously now you're not applying, but is it more so just these connections that you now found in Canada, and they're coming to you like, hey, maybe this would be a good position for you, or hey, we heard about you through this client. How has that changed now in your second half?
Yeah, I'd say that every networking job I've found in Canada hasn't been a job that's been presented to me or offered to me in terms of, hey, have you thought about this? I had to get it. Now, in the first half of my career, well, not first half, hopefully it's a bit longer than 20 years, but in my 20s in Australia, I was probably a bit younger, a bit more in my comfort zone. I didn't really have to think about these things as much. I was really just going from university to my first job to my second job to my third job. But clearly, then moving to another country pushes you out of your comfort zone quite a bit, and it forces you to rethink things. So one of the things I had to rethink was that job application process, because I have applied for jobs in my time in Canada, but I have never really, to be honest, got very far with that. I haven't found that applying for a job has been a successful tactic for me in Canada. All four jobs that I have had in Canada in the last 8.5 years have been achieved through networking. And what has that looked like? It's been a pretty similar process each time, albeit the Wolfpack I'd consider a bit of an outlier, because that was essentially like, I'm doing this because I'm passionate about it, I'm fun, I don't know where this podcast is going. Next thing you say, oh, maybe this could actually turn into something where I get paid for it. And that was kind of how that one went. But the other three jobs that I've had at IMI, T1, and Nielsen, it was really a fact of either meeting someone through a contact, meeting someone, you know, through reaching out to someone on LinkedIn, lining up calls. It was often meeting one person who'd pass me to another person who then we had a firmer discussion around. So it's that, I guess, that kind of like 6 degrees of separation. You speak to one person, they connect to another person. Maybe that person knows someone who's looking for someone. So that's sort of how it's worked for me here. If I had to go down that path again, I'm not planning to right now because I'm happy in my position at Nielsen, but that is the approach I would take again. But I will say one thing, and it's not a reality that everyone can do this. If you do have an opportunity to have some downtime between jobs, I do think that's very valuable. Clearly, there's a financial implication for that for most people. But for two of the positions, well, actually three of them that I've had in Canada, I did, you know, leave jobs voluntarily and then take some time off to consider my next move and purposely give myself a little bit of a breathing, space after a job, 2 3 weeks to just chill out, enjoy. Because for me, yes, you might not make that money in the short term, but having that time to think and plan and strategize should ultimately earn you, hopefully, a greater salary and career in the long term. But at the same time, I totally understand that people can see a job they like, they're in another job, they make the jump pretty seamlessly. But for me, I've really benefited from having some time off to think through my next move, which has ultimately led me to positions that I've been really happy with when I've landed them.
Yeah, that's an interesting takeaway. I never really thought of that. Maybe from that North American mindset where it's go, 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 and it's, hey, high paced. And as you're kind of speaking about that, just in regards to obviously going from Australia to Canada, that as you're saying, that's a difficult jump. That's a big change. Was there? I know you touched on it earlier, but is that something you'd maybe even recommend people try at least once in their career, or even just because obviously it's getting you out of your comfort zone, and you're going to find out things about yourself that you wouldn't have otherwise, right?
Absolutely. If you have an opportunity to live in another country, I would 100% recommend it. Australia and Canada, I'd say for the most part, are very similar cultures. I often think about people and young people that come from cultures that might be quite different from Canada and how that transition might be for them. But for me, I had some recognizable career experience under my belt when I came to Canada, which really helped me. But regardless, if you have opportunity to work in another market, whether it's the US or somewhere in Europe or Asia or Latin America or Australia or wherever it may be, 100% recommend it because it just broadens your experiences and your horizons. I will warn you, most other places in the world, if you like North American sports, aren't as favorable time zones to watch your favorite sports. But when you come the other way from Australia to North America, I must say it is a nice surprise to be watching American sports in prime time versus 3 a.m. in the morning. So that is certainly a nice perk from traveling from one side of the world to this part of the world.
Yeah, that just sparks some memories for me. I have some friends in Australia, and one of them's big into the NFL, and it'll be like Monday, 8 a.m. He's in his law class, and he's rooting on for the Giants, his favorite team. And then when I went to go visit them, I'm a Patriots fan, and I was like, hey, like, are we gonna watch the game? And I think again, it was 8 a.m. or some odd time that I just wasn't used to. Right, you're not used to watching sport at that time, so it is a unique experience, is what I'll say. That's some good stuff. And then, yeah, I guess one of the last things I want to get into before we kind of wrap it up is just in regards to your position now. What does that look like? What types of things are you doing? And yeah, maybe kind of take it away from there.
Sure. So I am a director at Nielsen Sports. I effectively lead our Canadian business. So we provide sports marketing analytics primarily for brands, properties, and agencies and media organizations across Canada. Nielsen is a business. Most people know the name. The majority of their revenue is generated via TV audience measurement in the US. But the sports part of the business was actually a company that was purchased, which was the company I used to work for in Australia, Repicon, between 2012 and 2014. So there's this kind of weird bit of synergy in my career from going from a company before I left Canada and coming back to the company that acquired it 8.5 years later, which gave me a really good grounding in the historical products, albeit it is part of a much bigger organization now. So my role is a combination of business development, of client service, and also some marketing and communications as well. We as an organization are really just starting to reestablish our presence in Canada on the ground, so to speak. We service clients from our US business for a couple of years there, which is great. But as we know, Canada is a similar sporting market to the US, but it is also quite different in many ways. So as someone who's been on the ground here now for 8.5 years, I feel like I understand the market pretty well. But for me, it's also important when you work for a big global organization to bring some of the best practices from around the world to clients locally, because while Canada may be a fairly sophisticated sponsorship market, that it still can sometimes, like perhaps the US, be a little bit insular in terms of what's happening in this continent and our sports here and our big leagues. So I'm very big on making sure our clients understand what's happening in Europe and Asia and the other parts of the Nielsen Sports business. But for me, it's majorly providing sponsorship media exposure data to clients, sponsorship valuations, consumer research, particularly around sports and sponsorship, but also doing a lot of work in the influencer marketing space now, because while that's not sponsorship per se, that is certainly a marketing channel where a lot of the principles are quite similar in terms of how you evaluate your investments. So that is a space that we're moving more and more into. But it's an exciting time at Nielsen. The company was recently purchased and privatized, so we're not quite sure exactly where the organization is heading in future, but from what we've heard, it's all very exciting stuff, and our clients, I think, will get the benefit of that both in Canada and globally.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially just the aspect of getting more into the influencer marketing space. That's not something I would have expected. And is that something where it's even in regards to, let's say, athletes, right? Athletes are almost kind of becoming influencers now with their social media handles. Is that something that you're referencing, especially from Nielsen Sports?
Yeah, so the Nielsen Sports name is a little bit misleading in some ways, because it's not just sports that we work in. We work in entertainment. So we would work with organizations, for example, that have 1,000+ global ambassadors, and they could be athletes on social media, they could be yoga teachers, they could be fitness coaches, but they could also be fashion influencers, they could be beauty influencers. It really, they are the two industries that spend the most on influencer marketing in Canada. So as you say, though, in the sports area, we're getting to a time now where a lot of the athletes and the sports influencers are almost bigger in terms of following than the teams themselves. So that people are still trying to determine what is that way that a team's marketing assets coincide with maybe an athlete's or an influencer's, and who gets access to what. But I think it's a really exciting space to work in. It's a space that Nielsen Sports and Entertainment is doing more and more in all the time, because brands are spending a lot of money on influencer marketing. It's growing all the time, and it's not just about these mega influencers with millions of followers. We're talking about smaller niche influencers with maybe 10 to 50,000 followers who can really reach authentically into communities across the country and the globe. So yeah, that's a space that is a lot of brands are doing work in, and we're really excited to work with our clients to help them understand the ROI of their influencer marketing spend.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Just in regards to, let's say, the next generation of, let's say, sports and entertainment fans, right? Where even just kind of speaking to my younger cousin now, or even just reading up on, people her age, they're much less into, let's say, the team on the front of the chest, right? And more so just the name on the back, right? Where they're fans of individuals rather than teams or leagues, etc. So that's kind of unique to see where that ends up going. I'm sure that's the only space that's going to get larger and larger. But yeah, this has been fantastic. And before I let you go, I have 2 questions I'd like to ask every guest at the end of every podcast. So for those who listen, they probably get annoyed with how often I say this, but I'm set. I'm going to 103 years old. I'm going to be on a rocking chair, enjoying my life and thinking back on all the good stuff. So let's say you get to 103 as well. You're on a rocking chair. You're going back and forth, just thinking about your career. And to date, what's one story or one experience that's happened that you'd be sitting in that rocking chair at 103 and be like, wow, that's something pretty cool I got to do for work?
I would probably go to my Wolfpack days, because while it was for me not a long-term job, it was a job that was really like, how the hell did I get here? So to go from a podcast to hosting 10,000 fans in a stadium, which is not a huge amount in the global standards, but if you've seen the stadium where we used to play, it was quite a lot of people. And then basically running a game day and having a team flying back and forth from the UK to play here, like to be a key part of helping execute that. And essentially my friend and I, he was the one that came to Canada first, I came later, we went to school together in Australia, and then 20 years later, we're both working in operational commercial roles for a sports team in our new home city from a sport that we grew up with, that our fathers loved and their fathers loved. To me, that's a pretty cool moment. It was not a moment where I was like, I want to be doing this in 5 years' time. It's too stressful. But the high of seeing that on game day, as you know, if you've worked in pro sports, like the high of game day and playing a key part in that, and seeing a sport that is not really that popular globally be in my new hometown with people really getting into it, for me, that's a moment that I'll always remember.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And I guess the last question I have, obviously went to the future, now going all the way back into the past, and let's say it's a 16, 18, 20-year-old Scott. What's something that you've now learned throughout your career that if you got to go, let's say, back in the future to speak to a younger version of yourself, what's the thing you'd embark on a younger version of yourself, or even, let's say, the listeners, or even myself?
I mean, it sounds cliched because a lot of people probably say it, but it is really just the power of networking, making sure that you push yourself out of your comfort zone to have as many conversations with as many people as you can. I mean, that has opened up so many opportunities for me in this country, and I'm sure every country has a different culture in terms of how that sort of thing works, but you can uncover so many opportunities for yourself by just speaking to people and listening to them, and presenting yourself in the right way, like not coming at people saying, hey, I need, I'm looking for this, this, and this. Like, butter up their ego a little bit, make them know that you know who they are and what they do, and you're impressed, and that you want to get their advice because they're experts in the field. So I'd say that is certainly something that is not going away, whether it's a Zoom environment or an in-person environment. I mean, getting out there, expanding your network, having conversations, and ultimately a lesson that I touched on earlier, if I can add a second part to this, is, I mean, do what you like doing, not necessarily what you think you should be doing. And I think that's a lesson that a lot of people probably learn early in their studies or their careers, because it's easy to do what you like to do. It's hard to do what you think you should do unless you like it as well. So for me, that was a very early lesson of studying politics in my first semester at university. I'm nothing against politics, but for me, that was a lesson of like, I'm just going to learn more about sports because that's what I'm into. So that would be the two things: one, networking, and two, do what you like, not necessarily what you think you should do.
Yeah, no, I think that's the reason why, like, asking that question at the very end, it's kind of a perfect way to bring it all together. And yeah, it's funny enough what you're saying for that second piece of advice: do what you like doing, because it almost seems to be a theme that everyone comes on the podcast, they start in politics, journalism, law, etc., and they all hit a wall where, like, hey, this is not something that I can do for the rest of my life. And then that's when they go chase their dream or go chase their passion that's going into sports or whatever else that may be. But no, this has been fantastic. And unless there's anything else you'd like to share, I just really appreciate you taking the time and coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. It's been fun, and look forward to checking out future episodes.
Perfect. Well, that's it for episode 121. See everyone next week.